Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. My name is Chris Burgner. I head up finance and analytics here at Equals, and will be moderating the discussion today. Before we jump in, just wanted to give a quick rundown on agenda. In the first 20 minutes, we'll work our way through the pre-submitted questions that y'all filled out in the Typeform registration. And then with the last 10 minutes in the meeting, we'll open that up to the live Q&A. And we'd really love your help in making this an engaging discussion. So please be sure to submit your questions throughout the conversation. Trenton from our team is going to be monitoring the chats on both the Riverside stream and the live streams. And we'll do our best to answer those in the order they were received at the end. So now that we've got the housekeeping out of the way, I'll introduce our guest, Brad Floering. Brad is the VP of FP&A at Snowflake. He first joined the team in 2017 when the company was around 300 employees and less than 100 million in revenue. Safe to say a lot has changed in the 6 years since you first started, Brad. And one of those big changes was the forecast transformation you led internally that helped bring the company's forecast accuracy from within 25% to 0 to 2%, enabling one of the largest software IPOs in history back in September of 2020. Quite a feat. We're so excited to have you today to learn from your experience, Brad. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. Excited to be here to be sharing kind of everything that we've done. So happy to answer people's questions. So hopefully it's an engaging conversation.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. I thought I would start with a quick recap on some of the things that we covered in the blog post for anyone who may have missed it. Brad, do you mind just giving us an overview of what the forecasting process first looked like when you joined Snowflake and how that evolved leading up to and through the IPO?
Sure. I won't go into a great amount of granular detail just because I could take up a lot of time just on that. But just so people don't know, I mean, in terms of Snowflake's business model, we're what's called a usage-based or consumption-based business model. We charge people based upon their actual time of using our service. And so even though we are a software company, our business model is very different. And so when I first entered the company, as typical probably for a lot of companies in the private stage, my boss at the time, he had come from another software company, and the way that we were projecting or forecasting revenue was like a traditional software company. And so we had our bookings amount, and then we would straight line those bookings amount over the period of time that the customer is signing up, so 12 months or whatever it is. And obviously doing all the budget versus actuals month in and month out, our revenue forecast was just not very accurate, right? It's not how our customers were using our product. Because if you think of just something like a software tool like Salesforce, right? Like when you sign up something like Salesforce, you don't just day one, all the users are in there and all the data's in there and people get to use it right away, right? There's this ramp period of time for, where IT is doing the implementation process, setting the system up, then you do UAT, and then you're getting to introducing users. And so the software adoption curve is not a linear curve like you would see in terms of their revenue recognition. It's much more sort of this slow ramp and exponential. And so what that meant for our revenue forecasting was that we were constantly over forecasting. As a growth company, our bookings quarter over quarter was always a record number. And so we would straight line that. And so what we saw was that we were over forecasting revenue quite a lot. And so I tried to go down the path of doing it in Excel in terms of having more of an exponential curve versus a linear curve, but soon found out that all customers kind of behave differently, and also depending upon the customers, how long they've been a customer, they behave differently. And so inherently we needed to derive a financial model forecasting each customer individually. So we turned to really using data science. And so I've been in the company 6 years. It was about 6 months in that I hired my first, data person, data analyst to help me kind of work on this problem. And we moved it from Excel to a data science model written in Python. And so, some of the problems we encountered were obviously, again, the life cycle. So brand new customer, um, where you had no historical data on how the customer was going to behave. We called that the cold start problem. And so how do you forecast customers where you have no historical usage of? And so talking to peers, talking to companies that were much more mature from us from a consumption standpoint, which is very few. So talking to AWS, and they came back to me and said, that's actually just greenfield for us, and we don't forecast. And it's like, okay, great. Well, that's good for a business as big as yours, but meaningful for us in terms of a private company. I can't just ignore new customers coming on the platform. So we had to really build three different data science models, again, based upon how long a customer has been with us, and one attacking that cold start problem where we have no historical data, then getting to the stage where you have some data, but also, not that much. And so you're still similar to the cold start, you're doing more like segmentation, finding similar companies where you do have historical data and extrapolating from that to, what we call the cap N model, which is our most mature customers, where all of a sudden now we have a lot of historical usage. And we do look at everyone's daily amount of consumption, and then we extrapolate or forecast. And so we basically have a model for every single customer in here at Snowflake.
Yeah, a little bit daunting to have to take on problem solving for something that a company as sophisticated as Amazon still hadn't yet figured out. So kudos to you and the team for being able to nail that. You talked a lot about the forecast being done at the customer grain, which I think is unique compared to how a lot of other businesses do that. That must be something that makes it really easy and transparent for you to be able to compare forecasts versus actuals at a customer level. Just curious, how do you go about addressing those after the fact to sort of fine tune the model or change something on the operational side?
Yeah, no, I mean, when you are forecasting to that granular level, it does give you that advantage where you get to see very clearly where your misses were. And so, first, I think you need to, what we do is look at all those different deltas and figure out if that was customer driven delta, right? Because, like, at the end of the day, customers are going to change their behavior and habits. And so, was it something that could we have seen or forecasted? And as part of our forecast process, it's beyond just using data science models. We also, for our top customers, go talk to the sales team as well, because they're boots on the ground. They're talking to the customer, and they might be able to give us insight into, hey, this customer is about to bring on a new workload, right? They're migrating an on-prem solution to Snowflake. And so that's something that we wouldn't forecast based upon their historical usage. And so we talk to the sales team that owns the account. We try to understand, was this customer driven delta, or was this a forecasting error problem? Let's, if it's customer driven, there's not much you can do about that other than the fact that you need to make sure you have a responsive model that's taking that into account after it's already kind of learned of that. If it's forecast driven, right? One, the beauty of having data science models, and these are machine learning models, and we forecast every single day. And the reason why we do that, one, we have more recent, we always have one more day worth of data to go do it, but we retrain our models off of that. And so our models are also getting better and better at predicting this stuff. So some of that is almost automated in terms of the models are taking into account those deltas. But still, we want to investigate and understand, okay, if it was a forecast error, is this something that is a acute problem? Like, is this an edge case? Because at the end of the day, when you're talking about, okay, do we need to change something in our model to take into account this, this delta? There's going to be pros and cons to doing that. And so if you, for a number of times where we're very good on an aggregate basis, the individual basis, there's a lot more variance. are we going to be sacrificing individual accuracy? Are we going to sacrifice, we want to get more accurate on the individual without necessarily impacting the aggregate? And so in some cases, the edge cases are something that we just acknowledge and we hope to catch as part of our process of talking to the sales organization, but it isn't something that we're necessarily going to take into account in our actual forecast, or change our models to go do that. So it it requires a lot of data as well, right? So it's like you're forecasting a lot, but then you're also viewing your data a lot. So I
Mm-hmm.
view my revenue, I look at revenue every single day, and I understand what's driving that revenue every single day. And we've been able to, again, being a data company, data heavy, we have dashboards to automatically provide us that insight so that we're not spending a lot of time. Otherwise, you might get lost in a lot of the details, and you just can't do that.
Yeah, so sort of a good problem to have, but could be a problem nonetheless, I suppose. And being able to see how things change each day, I'm sure is quite valuable. And because you do it every single day, you're not necessarily waiting till the end of the quarter to reconcile something. You can sort of be having those live conversations with sales throughout the quarter or whomever might be managing that account. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're we have a cadence at least of talking to our top accounts at least once a quarter in terms of understanding what the customer might be doing, and whether or not they agree to our forecast. But then we're certainly reactionary within the quarter, where if we see a large behavior change, and we have a dashboard that, because we forecast every single day, we have a dashboard that looks at, okay, this is the latest forecast, this is what the plan was at the beginning of the quarter that we used for planning purposes, what we guided the street to, and it also gives us all the appropriate deltas in terms of, hey, this customer is the most off by plan in a negative sense. And so we can, we have that data, and then we can immediately be reactionary and go talk to the sales team about, hey, why is this account not performing the way that we thought and or you thought? Because we did get their feedback at the beginning of the quarter.
Yep. Makes a lot of sense. Sticking with the theme of sales, this was a specific question we got around sales capacity planning. Um, has the framework and focus shifted from being bookings and ACV towards something more like consumption-orientated metrics, or does Snowflake still focus on bookings and contract value when it comes to top-line planning and target setting for the sales team?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I think you could definitely spend a whole hour just talking about sales planning and the capacity planning side of it. And I do think there are some small, I mean, maybe not so small, but like there are differences in a consumption-based model versus a traditional software, where the capacity model is the most important, because that's really what's also then forecasting your revenue as well. So, I mean, we, if you read our filings, you'll see that we talk about that we commission our sales team off of both consumption and bookings. And so when you're talking about paying a sales team off of any metric, you're going to internally build a forecast, set targets, and measure against that. And so we still very much have targets that we set from a bookings perspective, although it's then a little bit different than the way that most people might do it in traditional software and seat-based licenses, which is, one of the things that I've learned in this time is really your customer's consumption ends up driving the bookings, which is the complete opposite order for a traditional software business. And so people will build a capacity plan, i.e., look at the number of headcount that they have for sales. This is the level of productivity, and come to a bookings number. Here we have to do, okay, our customers' consumption looks like this. And so this is, we've built also a data science model to forecast how will the customer book, right? The consumption tends to lead to the actual booking and growth amount. Not to say that there aren't times where a customer knows, hey, I'm about to do this large migration. I want to book, I want to buy enough credits to deal with that migration as well. that tends to be pretty rare just because of how we've structured our contracts in terms of being very flexible, of adding additional what we call capacity, which is additional credits or time of usage of compute for doing these sorts of jobs and queries. But anyways, that's just very rare because of the fact that they can add capacity at any point. So what we see is if we forecast the revenue accurately, then we can forecast the bookings amount, and then we can back into, okay, based upon our sales, headcount, is that the appropriate level of efficiency that we need? Is that overstretching our sales organization versus it's a complete opposite? But I will say in terms of new logos, though, we still do it that way, where we look at, okay, this is how many salespeople we have focused on going out and getting new customers. This is what we expect in terms of productivity, and that drives an important part of our model and forecasting, which is how many new customers are we forecasted to land across the year, and then the revenue forecast in terms of that cold start model forecast how those customers will behave.
Yep, that's really helpful. Thanks for all the detail there, Brad. One question on process. How have you basically taken this kind of body of work that you've uh, almost perfected on the forecasting side and link that to things like strategic development at the company level?
Strategic planning or development?
E-
I'll address the
Either that
planning
strikes
side.
you as more interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's many different ways that I think you could go with that. The so one, what I already talked about in terms of we forecast every single day, and so one, in looking at that dashboard, right, we understand, okay, revenue is coming in higher than our forecast. And you can do the simple math in your head in terms of like, okay, our contribution margin for this revenue is X%. So what we're anticipating for an operating profit is Y. Okay, what are there things at the beginning of the quarter that we had planned or wanted to do that we just didn't do because of budgetary concerns? And so we can be reactionary within the quarter, i.e., we can almost revise our plan in quarter to release some of that budget for groups to go spend on, which, because we're at the end of the day, what we're talking about is investment in our growth. And so we want to be able to invest as much as we can in our growth as we can. And so we'll have those conversations with teams then of we're going to have a surplus from an operating profit standpoint. Let's go invest further into our growth. And so that's one way in terms of how it's benefited us from a planning perspective. We also do, there's the annual planning process, and then I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that we also we also do a 10-year model here at Snowflake. And so again, we leverage our what we've built in terms of that those three models that we talked about that in the blog, that we built will forecast the next couple of years for us, and then we have a separate model then that forecasts the remaining 8 years. And that then helps us. One, we have an investor day every June timeframe where we give guidance in terms of when we think we'll hit 10 billion in revenue, and that's coming from the 10-year model. But then also, okay, at 10 billion, what is our anticipated margin profile look like? What does our free cash flow and operating profit look like? And those are important metrics for investors. And that provides us then that 10-year model provides us the guardrails as part of our annual planning process every year, right? Where it's like, we know over the next 5 years or whatever we communicated in our 10-year model to the street, we need to get to an operating profit of X%. You're not going to get there overnight. And so what are the stepping stones we need to get year by year? What's the amount of leverage we need to see every year? And that ultimately sets what we may dictate to the rest of the company in terms of how much we can afford to spend each year. And so, you know, you cannot do your annual plan or any of that stuff until you have a clear picture, an accurate picture of what your revenue is going to be at. Because again, the most important things to our investor base when we communicate is, they want to see leverage in the bottom line. They want to know, one, they want to understand revenue growth. We're, still a high growth company. And so they want to understand what that is, but they also want to see what is our profitability from a non-GAAP perspective, and can we get leverage? Because as revenue growth comes down, which you'd expect as part of law of large numbers, the expectation is obviously that operating margin goes up. And so are we showing enough leverage in the model? And so revenue forecasting is hugely important, first and foremost, if you're going to do any level of planning and goal setting.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks for all the detail there. I'm going to transition to some of the live questions that have come through because we've been getting a lot of great ones. And if there's any of these that you don't have full context on, Brad, we can try and do a follow up at another time. But got a question here on the data on the data model forecasting. Are you largely basing this on historical consumption, or are you also looking at product measures like feature activation, logins, clicks, or whatever might be relevant to drive revenue on the Snowflake side?
Yep. So I think it depends very much on the model. If you're talking about what we refer to as our cap-end model, which is for the most mature customers, that's purely based off of their daily consumption amount. If you're talking about the earlier models where we don't have, again, that historical consumption, we spent a lot of time when we were deriving that model in terms of looking at different attributes of companies to do segmentation. And so certainly I think one of the ones that we feel like was most that was relevant in the early days was the size of the organization. So we had data in terms of how many employees, which at that point would be sort of a proxy for number of users that may use Snowflake. And so we did do some level of segmentation of, hey, this is a large organization. It has over 10,000 employees. What are the other customers that we have where we do have historical usage that have over 10,000 employees? And so I think for the earlier models, because you're again trying to look at ways to find similarities between customers that you then have data on, you do end up using that. And we're always, even though, like, I think at this point we're very happy with our overall aggregate percentage error rate, but there's always ways to improve. And really what we're trying to improve upon is our account level accuracy. And so we're always looking at deriving new models or implementing new models that use different level of data. And so we've looked at different product level data, and in some cases it just hasn't been as accurate as what we've already created in the cap-end model scenario.
I'm going to try and consolidate a couple of questions into one here. There's a earlier question around how far out are you forecasting? And I think you gave an answer to that, which is for the 3-model approach, it's 1 to 2 years out. And then there's this secondary 10-year model that is a sort of long-range view on the business. What are some of the assumptions that you work off of to build out the 10-year model, and how does that differ from the 3-year model approach that looks a year or two out in advance?
Yeah, I mean, we forecast out in the 10-year model. I think everyone's natural approach when you first build a model that far out is to look at comparable companies. And so looking at companies that are already at that revenue profile, what did their margins look like? And so in the early days of building out our 10-year model, that was the approach that we went. And what we found so far is we in a consumption-based model, we can actually be a lot more efficient. And so the first 10-year model that we ever did when we, essentially went public, we beat those metrics, or could beat those metrics pretty quickly. And so we evolved from looking at comparable companies where it's like, okay, at 5 million, at 5 billion in revenue, X percent was dedicated to G&A. We moved away from that thought process to what did the growth rates look like of expenses, rather than worrying about what the percentage of revenue was, just because again we were already so much more efficient than other companies, all the comparable companies that were the traditional license-based models. And that's how we've derived so high level assumptions in terms of growth rates within each one of our departments of expenses. And I mean, I won't review again in terms of all of our revenue model, but other than what I talked about in terms of that fourth model that's forecasting years really 3 through 10. We do that from a net revenue retention standpoint, which is one of our key metrics. But we will make assumptions in terms of looking at historicals of, okay, a customer's net revenue retention rate at year 5 with this type of profile, and then we'll apply that to all the customers that would be of that profile getting to year 5 perhaps in fiscal year 27, right? And that's how we've derived forecasting out years 3 through 10.
Very helpful. I know we're getting a little close on time, but Brad, do you have a few minutes to go over if we have a couple more questions coming through here?
Yeah,
Great.
happy to talk a little bit more.
Awesome. So what how else have you or where else in the business have you applied this sort of forecasting methodology? Like, we're talking about forecasting revenue right now. Are there other line items that you're trying to use a similar machine learning modeling approach?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll make it a little bit more broad in terms of, I mean, what I've already talked about is in terms of data science models, right? So we forecast revenue, obviously. We also forecast our bookings, and I already brought that up as well. So we actually have a data science model for predicting bookings amount, which the amount isn't necessarily as hard as much as predicting when a customer will buy and what they'll buy from us, just because, again, customers can just what we call an amendment or amend. They're just going to add additional capacity to their existing contract. And so that can be a much smaller amount versus a customer that says, hey, I'm running out of credits. I'm going to do a renewal or an early renewal. And that looks like a much larger buy. And so predicting when customers are going to do an amendment versus an early renewal when they run out of credits is actually a very difficult thing. And so we've applied data science to that as well. And so anything that's really very difficult, like our most difficult things to forecast, which is a lot of our top line metrics, we'll do that too. But being a little bit more broad in terms of a data science approach to stuff, I mean, the thing I haven't talked about yet is really our cloud infrastructure spend, and we've taken a very data. I mean, that for us, for finance, that is our big data problem, which it's maybe a little bit more unusual for someone to have as much cloud infrastructure spend as us, since we're built on top of these cloud vendors. But it is the same, I think, amongst other companies, where it's like you have a supply chain. The supply chain ends up being a very big data problem for you, and that's our big data problem. And so we get our what we call cost and usage report from our all 3 cloud vendors, and we ingest that data every 4 hours. And we're talking about petabytes worth of data, where it, think of a customer spins up a warehouse to go do a job, and then it suspends, and then it gets returned to us. We get all of that granular data, and we've built models then on top of all of that data to do attribution of all of that activity to customers, to internal spend. So we have a clear picture in terms of what is really driving our cloud infrastructure costs, i.e. our COGS, so that we can forecast it better. But then what does our contribution margin look like on an individual customer level, which is important data for the deal desk team as they're working with sales to negotiate how much of a discount can we really afford. Is this going to be dilutive to our overall sort of targets for the company's product gross margin? That was all awesome. And then we applied. And that's been the really interesting thing about creating these real-time models that are very detailed is its application even outside of finance. And that's true of the revenue forecast, where we share it to the sales organization, who then shares it to the customer, and the customers are using that to make decisions of, hey, I look like I'm going to burn through my credits, I really can't afford to do that. They're managing based upon our revenue forecast. But again, this concept of sharing our forecast data on the cog side, we actually will provide, since we have supply side data, and that's what we've been talking about, that's very granular, and we understand all the resources that are being consumed. We have the demand side data, which is what our customers are actually doing. We can see when there is anomalies where it's like a resource. Amazon is now charging us a lot more for this resource. We're not seeing anything on the demand side. Why is that? And we can go talk to engineering, and so we have anomaly detection to go do that, or just alert us to that fact. And then we find out, oh, we actually just released something into our into our production software that created a bug or a leakage. And so engineering is now alerted, and they know that that there's a capability to go fix something and do that in real time, versus waiting to the end of the month or end of the quarter when you're closing the books and saying, okay, why is this expense a lot higher than what I thought? And so that's that type of data science approach has saved Snowflake, given our cloud infrastructure spend like tens of millions of dollars every year, to be able to have that sort of automation and anomaly detection built on top of a very sophisticated model.
One other one on just sort of like attributes of the model and what you take into consideration. How do you factor in things like new products that are being launched, pricing changes, etc.? What are some of like the baseline assumptions you form on those when it's so new, or there's going to potentially be a behavioral shift in the business?
Yeah. And we don't want to bake that stuff necessarily into these machine learning models, right? Like we measure its, like what we call the raw forecast. This is just what the model is pumping out, and we measure its accuracy based off of that. It obviously is not going to have, I mean, one of the things that you learn in a consumption based model, especially if you're measuring, like we're charging customers based off of time, we make the product more efficient. Like we upgrade, or change the software to make things better for our customers. That actually reduces our revenue, right? It reduces their cost. It decreases our revenue, or how much we're charging them. And so we don't want to necessarily, that stuff the model isn't going to be able to pick up on, right? Like in terms of, hey, you have this new release coming on, you're going to increase your, the one that we've talked about historically publicly was storage compression. Our we don't want to we don't want the model to forecast that stuff happening. We control that in terms of having an understanding with working with product. On this date, we're going to start releasing this compression for storage that's going to lower our storage revenue. And so we'll make manual adjustments then off of the actual raw forecast. So we'll work. Our data science team works with the product team very closely in terms of forecasting what the actual impact will be, and then we provide that as a manual adjustment when we're actually making our final call on the forecast. And so we'll have almost an allowance then of like, this is what the forecast is specifically for this this item that is new. And we more do that for the stuff that's going to be a headwind to revenue. The stuff that's going to be a tailwind, which is like new product initiatives, or anything like that, we tend to not necessarily, like, we might have an internal forecast of what we think it will be, but there's actually a lot more variables in that, right, in terms of customer adoption. And so typically we don't bake those types of things into our forecast. But as again, the machine learning models are learning, as customers start to adopt that product, it will start to pick it up on its own, and start to forecast it. So different depending upon whether it's a headwind or tailwind.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, I think last one that I have, and then would love to see if there's any more questions that come through. Kind of going back to this idea that was the call to action towards the end of the blog post. You mentioned that there's a real importance for teams to build out an expertise in SQL and data modeling for finance and ops leaders going forward. How would you go about advising leaders that were maybe in a similar situation you were in when you first joined, when you knew, hey, I need to bring this new and differentiated skill set into the team? I don't have experience with that sort of like field of work. How did you go about evaluating candidates and providing the coaching and guidance to them along the way?
Yeah, yeah, it's a question I get a lot when I talk to customers about what we've done, and they want to do something similar. Because yeah, as a finance professional, I don't know the technical side. Oh, are you there? My
Yeah,
screen
we
is
can still hear you fine.
okay. Um, Sorry, my screen went black for a second. Um, so one when I joined the company, we had a centralized data science, BI team, and what we were talking about, and what was more of what we called internally a federated strategy, where finance would have their own data team, and it was obviously important to get that alignment with the overall centralized function, that was something that they wanted to support as well, and then have them involved in that interview process where they were doing the technical screens with the candidates, because I'm not going to be able to do it. In having that sort of tight, I mean, again, and I think that's probably the hardest thing in that regard, is getting alignment with the centralized function, which for us at that time lived in product. That one, this is a strategy we wanted to pursue. That they were okay with the fact that there would be this team that doesn't directly report to them, and then they would help in the interviewing process. But also, I mean, everyone's going into a company thinking, not just about, hey, how much money am I going to make at this company, but also what does my professional development look like? And so for the first, when I hired my first data analyst, that person actually sat with the product data science org for the first 6 months, basically. And they were learning from them. And so they had that relationship. They could still have the mentorship, because me as the direct line manager for that individual, I'm not going to be able to push their boundaries in terms of their skill set from a technical standpoint. And so we always had a great relationship with other people in the organization, other people within Snowflake, that would be able to provide that professional development, that sounding board that was needed when we hired our first person. And the first person is definitely the hardest one to hire. I think also the biggest lesson I learned is I searched a long time for my first hire, which was, I think I was looking for the the purple squirrel, or the unicorn, or whatever people want to say, in terms of like someone that had experience with both finance and data analysis. And I pursued that path for a really long time, and then I hired someone that didn't have the finance experience. And I think from there, most of the people, and now I have a data science org of 6 people and a BI org of probably 18 people. I think very few of them actually came into Snowflake with any sort of background in accounting or finance. They had the technical skill set, and we can actually teach it, which is fortunately, I'm talking about really, finance and accounting is more commoditized, but that's the truth of the matter. Is I can teach them what I know, which is the finance side. I can never teach anyone how to write things in Python. So
Yep, that's super helpful, and it sounds like there's this common theme of kind of reaching out to others and experts for advice. That was something that you did early in your time, and talking to AWS. That's something that you did in the hiring process here, and this kind of concept of being an infinite and curious learner, I think is always rewarding. So that makes a lot of sense.
100%.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today, Brad. This was a lot of fun chatting with you and obviously collaborating on the blog post before that as well. I think we got a lot of great questions answered and a ton of amazing insight out to the attendees. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me. It was great.